of Learning and Forgetting was written by Frank Smith and outlines his thoughts on a major issue with the American education system. So through this, we're going to go through a quick summary, the main points of the book, a few quotes, and then some questions to ponder that were really brought up throughout the reading. Let's dive into our summary on this book real quick, and I'm going to try to keep this as short and concise as possible. In the book, it goes through two different views of learning. The first view is the classic view of learning, in which learning is effortless and that learning is always happening, even if we're not aware that it's happening. Also, we tend to learn from the people we surround ourselves with or the people we identify with. That's what's considered the classic view. Now, he dives a little bit deeper into the whole idea of effortless learning. This doesn't mean you don't have to do anything to learn, but simply learning is not hard work. It's a matter of it occurring naturally instead of it being forced. And then we have the official theory, which starts off really from militaristic origins. So the official theory starts off with the idea of taking what worked for the Prussian army, which was standardization and a predictable pattern, and applying that to education. So we see that in the form of grade levels arranged by age, not necessarily by ability, and also in standardized curriculum by age, and then a set progression. So you can't just skip grades, you follow in that set predictable pattern. Then we see the introduction of psychology into education, and this is B.F. Skinner. And within this, you have the whole behaviorist movement and the fact that education and learning can be measured. So whenever we see education, it shifts to making learning measurable, and that we can see that by having some basis for measurement. Also, it becomes a time where teachers are expected to keep detailed records, like the students are an experiment, so that they can prove that learning is occurring. So it's all about everything being observable within education. He also notes that this is a time when they're trying to make psychology a valid science instead of an art. And then we have the introduction of logistics. So with World War II, we see huge plans come together that are very successful in the sense of an overall goal. And we see that same method applied to education, as in learning should be a centralized and managed type of experience. So you get your orders from a centralized location, the teacher carries out those orders, and the student is the consumer, so they're the end result. So it's really like rank and file military order where you just follow what you're told to do and it works. Then we see testing coming in to validate learning, as in we need to be able to place students in the right setting. We need to be able to actually tell where students stand, and they need to know where they stand as well. So testing comes into play with the official theory. And then we have the information age, as in students can sit at a computer and just absorb the information that we put into it. Because the whole idea of the official theory really goes back to that learning is predictable, we can always see it, and when it comes down to it, we can, force it in, because learning is simply a matter of effort and memorization. The good news is he ends the book by stating that not all hope is lost. We can return back to a natural state of learning if we'll just do a few key things, as in not focusing so much on memorization, and then also not trying to force learning on students, letting the student guide their own learning. One of the big questions is, would I recommend this book to someone else in this area, whether it be an educator or somebody actually in the same graduate program? And so going through this, I will say this is a very short book. It's a quick read and deals with a lot of content, but not necessarily in depth. So really kind of to sum this up pretty quick, I would definitely recommend this book to somebody in the education field. It's interesting to see some of the history behind it, although if you want to know more, this book isn't going to be a end-all be-all education book, and it really doesn't offer a whole lot of, examples of how we can improve things definitively, but it does get you thinking and brings up some good points within education and learning and really points that out. So whether you're in the instructional systems technology graduate program or just in the education field, I would highly recommend reading this book, mainly because it is a quick read, but does strike at the heart of a lot of issues that we see within education today. So the big points in this, we have that learning is a natural process that we aren't always aware is happening. We see that big push today as far as STEM and the whole idea of allowing students to explore and see what's happening. It's the same way with this, that learning's natural. Also, you don't have to worry about learning being a natural process because it already is. Students are born wanting to know more. Also, learning is going to happen whether you want it to or not. The major thing is, do we want the student to learn, I guess, what we need them to know, or are they going to learn something completely opposite? Like maybe they're just not very good at the subject, so they just shouldn't do it. We learn from the company we keep. So the group of people we hang around end up teaching us who we are and what we will do. But it's also stated that the company we don't keep also tells us who we are and who we're not. Through this, it's also pointed out that company doesn't have to just be friends. It can be books, it can be subjects, but whatever we surround ourselves with, that's what we become. That's what we learn. Learning can never be forced. So whenever we find ourselves trying to memorize a list of facts or go through a lot of material and not remember it, it's because learning is trying to be forced upon us. And this image is very indicative of what happens when learning is forced. It's frustrating, and students that are naturally curious and love to learn become turned off just by the idea that learning has to be hard work and it has to be forced. Also, education has drifted away from learning. So over time, we saw that education became less about learning and more about other trends within really the military or related fields. This image is really indicative of what we see today, where testing happens all the time. So we see a world of students that don't necessarily learn a whole lot sometimes, but they can take tests because that's the most important thing. But then the last major point is that things can change. There's still time to change the education system and get things back in line with what learning is. Really to make learning education. Not to make education into learning, but really to change it around to where those two terms are the same again. Because in the current, situation, they're not necessarily the same. These 5 quotes really stood out to me in the reading. So quote number 1, learning is not hard work. Something is being learned whether we want it or not all the time. And with that being said, I've seen too many times where learning is said to be hard work, or a student's told, well, if you just work hard enough, you'll understand. And this simply isn't true, because our lowest level learners and the ones that really need the most support and help through the process are told, if you just work hard enough, you'll understand. And that's not true. They can work as hard as they want to learn, or as hard as they want to, but they still struggle to learn because it's a forced process. Quote number 2, I've never heard a parent say, I'm not worried about the gang my son goes with. He's a slow learner. This goes back to the whole idea that learning is not forced and it occurs naturally. We do worry about the kinds of people our children hang around because we know that they'll learn from them naturally and pick up on what they do. And then eventually they'll become exactly like the people they hang out with. So we are very worried about that. And this quote really hits on that and hits on the fact that learning is a natural process. Quote 3, but we don't give ourselves credit for all the spelling knowledge we have because we focus on the relatively few words that we can't spell. This to me stands out in the sense of we do focus learning on what we don't know, not what we do know. So as a student, you're always told what you are not aware of or what you don't know, and we never really focus on the fact that there is so much that we do know. Quote 4, teachers were now in task forces while headquarters personnel specified the missions and the targets. Everyone was expected to spell out objectives that they would attain as part of the great overall design. Education became a product, teachers were instructional managers, and students the consumers. It was all supposed to go as smoothly as the invasion of Europe, with casualties kept to an avoidable minimum. So with this is my experience with education, is everything is centralized. And when it comes down to it, a central office will hand you a set of objectives that you must meet. The students are expected to meet it, and everything should go smooth, which is not always the case, because learning isn't one of those things that's always nice and neat. Sometimes it is a little messy. Sometimes it does take more time than expected. And then we have our last quote, trying to force students to learn or threatening to punish them if they don't learn inevitably has the opposite effect from what you want to achieve, no matter how much pressure your teaching responsibilities put upon you. This is very true. Students can't be forced to learn. It always ends up being the opposite, where they actually learn less whenever there's more pressure put on them. And just threatening to punish them if they don't learn obviously doesn't work, because that goes back into the whole point of, if learning is a natural process, you can't force it to happen. Finally, to wrap up this, some questions to ponder. These are some questions that were brought up during the reading, kind of that I thought of while this was going on. So the first one, how do we best educate children? I mean, if we know that education and learning have drifted apart, how do we reconcile that, and how do we actually best educate children? That ties into this next one. Now, how does standardized curriculum tie into this? Does standardized curriculum make learning more difficult? By standardizing the curriculum, have we made it almost impossible to learn? And if you base it on the book, Frank Smith would say yes, standardized curriculum has made it more difficult to learn. Not that it's impossible, but it's definitely made it difficult. And then lastly, this is personal. How can I approach learning with my own children? You know, I'm dealing with that right now. I have a 4-year-old, so we're learning a lot of basic early reading skills, language skills. So how do I approach that learning? Because is it hard work? Am I trying to make it hard work where we have to focus on this and we have to do this homework? Because if we don't do this homework, you're not going to learn it. You know, is it something that's repetitive, or is it something that comes naturally, that's fun and that's engaging? So all of these things tie into the book of Learning and Forgetting, and the whole idea that learning and education have been separate for quite some time. So looking at this, hopefully we can learn from this book and move forward and start to really transform the education system back into a system of learning and not just a system of education.